This is the desk I built almost entirely from old flooring. At first glance it might look like normal wood, but trust me, turning recycled parquet into something this solid and clean was really a challenge. Let me show you how it all came together. The project starts with me getting this particle board from the hardware store. This is the only thing I actively bought for this project. And at that time I was driving a convertible, so transporting it turned out to be quite a challenge. So I did what all convertible drivers do when they have to transport something. Open the roof and just throwing everything on the back seat. We successfully drove it to my parents' garage. Now for this project I kinda split my workspace a little. I've built the tabletop in my parents' garage and the base in my workshop. I did this because my workshop is quite small and there simply isn't enough space to move a lot of large builds around. It is really difficult for me to find a workspace where I can be loud in, so I try to do most of the quiet work in my parents' garage. But this also means no power tools at hand. This particular flooring I'm using is 2 mm of oak glued on an MDF base. And there are two reasons why I'm using it. The first one being, when you join them up, they have practically no gap in between them, which makes them perfect to use them as a tabletop. And the second reason is, with less actual oak on the top, it makes it less likely that the tabletop might warp over time. With the particle board being the cheapest, but definitely not the strongest base plate you can choose, this compound is definitely beneficial. At this point in the build, everything was coming together very nicely. I already made a fully dedicated video on how to build this tabletop, so I'm not going into too much detail here. But I can tell you, clicking this flooring in place is just so satisfying. And I also like using a hammer. After the glue has dried, I can cut it to size. And for that I'm using my track saw. I simply can't point out enough how much of a game changer a track saw is. It's not only a very versatile and unique tool that I think everyone should have, I think it's also very aesthetic. And with that Makita track saw I have, this is also my most precise tool, which will be important for later on. Now at this point, the edges of the particle board are exposed. And to fix that, I give it a thick oak edge banding. This makes the tabletop visually a little bit more interesting as well. Now it's time to build the base, which is split into two parts, with one being a leg and with the second one being a cabinet. But you're gonna see it yourself. Building the legs was probably the more tricky part, because one board of flooring is simply too thin to build a leg out of. So I glued them together, let them dry, and afterwards I got a nice big oak beam. Now the leg itself includes angles, chamfered edges and all that fancy stuff. So while ripping down the beams, I thought it might be wise to leave everything a little bit oversized. Which turned out to be a very good decision. I know someone who's a professional woodworker, and throughout this process I asked him a few questions. And after I told him my idea to glue up a bunch of wood flooring into a big beam, he didn't seem to be a fan of it. Especially because it's 3 boards and not 4. His concern was that the wood movement inside the glue might not be balanced enough and one of the boards might eventually come off. Now to not build up too much drama, the desk itself is now around 5 months old and nothing has come off so far. But he did have a fair point. It is extremely important to lay out the boards in a way it presses against each other. The one beam I glued up simply wasn't enough, so you've seen me made a second one that had to be ripped down as well. This really felt like woodworking. I started with a bunch of flooring glued on top of each other, and with every cut I made, the wood started to look way more clean and cohesive, like something that you can actually make furniture out of. Because I cut everything into batches, I decided to push everything through the planer so all the measurements are uniform. The leg is shaped like a trapezoid. That's why I cut them in an angle. And to put them together, I used my biscuit jointer. I think this tool is easily the second best investment I ever made in my workshop. Before that, I used a dowel jig that would not be able to help me here so easily. I remember that I've put this glue up together with my last drop of motivation, before I left my workshop. I was extremely tired and I was just trying to get it done, so it can peacefully dry overnight. And then I came across this little fella, who sums up the mood perfectly. Now as things go in my workshop, I ended up with a piece that is slightly too short. Because I wanted to avoid measuring as much as I can, my plan was to put everything together and then just mark the line like you see here. I glued on an off-cut with CA glue and cut everything to size afterwards. Now it was time for the actual glue up itself. And I knew it's going to be a stressful one if I don't set up everything correctly beforehand. So that was exactly what I did. To apply even clamping pressure, I used the angled offcuts to create a surface for the clamp to grab on. And after all that prep work, I can tell you this glue up was definitely one of the better ones. Back with some new motivation, I tackled the leg. After the glue dried, I could trim the sides with my track saw. Now I could sand the whole thing, and this is something I usually do if I'm lacking on motivation. After sanding, everything looks just way more put together, and this usually gives me the motivation to push on. What I was procrastinating this time were these little gaps here. These are from the extra glue up I made, but I somehow forgot to glue the boards together the right way, and therefore I have these gaps showing off from one side. But luckily these tenons I cut off the boards fit perfect in that gap, so I just glued them in and planed them by hand. The leg is close to the finish line now, and to top everything off, I rounded over the outside edges and gave the inside edges a little chamfer. And after that it was time to build the second part of the base. This includes a cabinet and a small leg on top of it. For that I glued up a few of these boards and I intentionally used the given jointery. Not only will the glue up be a little bit stronger, but also I like the flooring aesthetic that you get with the gaps between the boards. After that I cut them to their appropriate width and laid them next to each other for the next step. I want to join the cabinet with miters, and as I mentioned already, my track saw is the only tool that I can manage to accurately cut 45-degree angles. So I taped up the opposite sides to each other and then made the 45-degree cuts. And this way I can ensure they both have the exact same length. I used that method once before, but I only built a small box of it. I never tried it on a cabinet this big before, and by the lack of filming I have done, I can tell you it was quite stressful. One thing that was even more stressful than that was the glue up itself. I wanted to get it right and not be distracted by filming, so I just set up the camera to do a time lapse, because focusing on the glue up and make sure that everything is square was my main priority. And mid-through I decided to reinforce everything with brad nails. All in all, the glue up went quite well and I ended up with a very nice and square cabinet. But some of the miters needed some detailing. At this point I still didn't know what to do with the edges, because my plan is to eventually make some drawers for this cabinet. But then I spontaneously decided to round a few of them over. I finished the cabinet with adding some rubber balancing feet. I went with these feet because you have these hammer-in inserts, and I think this is a very nice way to install them. tabletop is not sitting directly on the cabinet. I've built a small leg that goes in between them that elevates it a little bit, which is simply a design choice. My plan was to simply screw that piece in, which is also what I did, but as it turned out this wasn't a good idea. You will see why later on. And with that, the base is basically done. Let's get back to the tabletop.
Hast du es auf dem Video?
The edges are glued on, and unfortunately I haven't filmed how I finished the tabletop. But if you're interested in that, you can watch the video I mentioned earlier. So let's just skip to the assembly. My plan is to connect everything with bolts and threaded inserts, just so it's easier to disassemble and move around. Now here's a little sneak peek of the table being upside down. I obviously have to support the cabinet, because the leg isn't in center. But I tried to put everything in its right spot, just to get a feel for the proportions. And at that point I knew this might be a project I can actually be proud of. Everything was built so far, and I finished it with a good coat of hard wax oil. Connecting the cabinet to the tabletop turned out to be not that well thought through. The gap between the small leg and the cabinet is too small to get the bolts in, so I had to connect the leg to the tabletop first and then screw the cabinet to the leg. If you think this table might look familiar, I did took some inspiration from the famous Four Eyes furniture table. Building the whole thing out of leftover flooring was the challenge here, and that's the part I'm most proud of. I always love when I can recycle some material that else would have been thrown away, and that is so not only because it's more cost effective as well. Thank you all for watching and see you in the next one.